So, for those who are watching, what we're talking about today is how to ostensibly address the issue of climate change. At least that's what the Liberal government would have somebody watching believe. Unfortunately, the motion that is before the House of Commons that we're debating today doesn't talk about the economy, and it has absolutely no action in it whatsoever. And you know what? This actually gives the House, more than anything, an excellent opportunity to discuss the Liberal government in the last 3.5 years' failures on both the issue of climate change as well as the issue of the economy. Because on both issues, by quantitative metrics, this government has failed. And that's what I want to lay out today. And I also want to lay it out in the context to the amendment that the Conservative Party has presented to this motion. And I want to start by reading an article that was posted in the National Post on August 9th, 2016. The title of the article is called "Serious Questions About Greenhouse Gas Emissions Policy." The byline is, "Those championing a carbon tax are positioning it as a silver bullet, but the fact remains that there are legitimate questions to be raised about Canada's approach to reducing greenhouse gas emissions." The Liberal government is developing, and you have to remember this was 2016, so it wasn't fully implemented yet, a national price on carbon, or a carbon tax. Those championing this policy instrument are positioning it as a silver bullet. They offer a delicious premise. A carbon tax won't cause any pain while immediately reducing greenhouse gas emissions in Canada. But the fact remains that there are legitimate questions to be raised about Canada's approach to reducing greenhouse gases. First, Canadians have a right to know how much emissions the government wants to cut, on what timeline it plans to do so, and why. Why would we set those targets? What is that going to do on the issue of climate change? What are the opportunity costs of us setting that target? It's difficult to measure a policy, if it's working, if we don't know what it will hope to achieve. To date, the political exercise of setting emissions targets in Canada has been mostly about my arbitrary target is bigger than yours, rather than discussing what is achievable under different scenarios. And what about other countries? Canada has a relatively low overall greenhouse gas emissions profile. Even if we impose one of the most restrictive reduction frameworks in the world, what can we do to make major emitters like Brazil, India, China, and the United States reduce their greenhouse gas emissions profiles? What happens if we implement a framework that makes our industries less competitive than those located in developing countries? What evidence do we have that a given policy proposal will work? Have the billions of dollars that Canada has spent on global mitigation and adaptation efforts made any impact? It will take more than just domestic policy to influence change. In terms of putting a national price on carbon, we need to know if that's the best option to reduce greenhouse gas emissions. At what price does the demand for gasoline, heating fuel, and other carbon products actually decrease in Canada? By how much and over what time period? What impact will it have on Canadian workers and lower-income Canadians? Will one region of the country be affected more than others? And where would all of these carbon tax dollars go? Will revenue from this tax go into general government coffers to offset large operational spending deficits? Will it be used to offset the economic impact of the tax, or will it fund the development of new technologies? How will this process be managed, and how much will it cost to manage? Recent reports show that the regulations on specific high-emission sectors, such as vehicles and the coal-fired electricity sectors, have caused greenhouse gas emissions to grow at a slower rate. More importantly, this happened while the economy was growing. And of course, this references policy that happened under the former Conservative government. The decoupling of economic growth in Canada's natural resource-intensive economy from greenhouse gas emissions growth is positive progress. Any national greenhouse gas reduction policy framework should set achievable targets. It should be able to be transparently costed and measured. It should simultaneously reduce greenhouse gas emissions, protect the job security of Canadian workers, and protect low-income Canadians.
Yes.
If a proposed greenhouse gas emission policy fails to show that it can reduce greenhouse gas emissions, or if it will have a detrimental impact on the economy, we should reject it. This likely means that presenting an idea that a carbon tax is a painless standalone cure-all is a fallacy in the cold, natural resource-driven economy that is Canada. Our GHG policy likely needs to consider phased-in sector-by-sector regulations. The current federal government isn't talking about repealing regulations put in place by the previous government, developing and adopting new, more efficient technologies and other approaches. They talk about the carbon tax and asking Canadians to make a financial sacrifice. And Canadians should have a say on whether or not they want to make it. We're seeing that happen with the provinces right now. The cost of GHG policy shouldn't be hidden in baffle-gab line items on electricity bills in order to avoid political scrutiny. Similarly, we should hold the proponents of these policies to account for their GHG emissions targets, regardless of their political stripe. This requires a non-dogmatic conversation about the issue. That, however, will take megatons of effort by all of us. It's a pretty good article. Do you know who that was written by in 2016? Me! Me! It was when we had this in the National Post 3 years ago. And the government has done nothing on any of these questions day after day. We've sat in the House of Commons and said, how much are you going to reduce greenhouse gas emissions by? How much tax does the residents of High River have to pay to not have to flood again? What is the price elasticity assumptions of your carbon tax? None of these things have been answered. Every day they're like, oh, the conservatives are doing. We've been asking these questions for 3 years after the Conservatives presented a track record of doing what? Reducing the growth of greenhouse gas emissions while seeing the economy grow. And what we've seen under this Liberal government is actually opposite. Greenhouse gas emissions, if they're doing anything, they're rising because they haven't actually put forward a plan that will reduce greenhouse gas emissions. They've just put forward a tax plan, okay? And what have we seen? My riding's out of work. And that's because this government is not using a carbon tax to reduce greenhouse gas emissions. They know it won't do anything. All they're doing it is to take money out of Canadian pockets, and that's wrong because a carbon tax disproportionately affects low-income Canadians. It puts small businesses out of positions where they can hire more people, and it is flawed public policy. Now, in the last 3 years, something very interesting has happened. Because there have been people like me and others, and yes, I have a degree in economics, shocker, I can talk about this. Economists have started backing off. The most militant pro-carbon price economists have started backing off. You'll notice that when the Prime Minister, and I remember sitting here, when the Prime Minister first started talking about the carbon tax, he used this as the policy outcome, reducing greenhouse gas emissions, because everybody around the world that says climate change is a problem says that if climate change is not going to be a problem, what do we need to do? Reduce greenhouse gas emissions. But when it comes to the carbon tax, I want to read you this great quote. I love this quote. Of course this quote happened, and it was written on October the 1st, 2017, once the anger in this country started mounting against the carbon tax, and it's in Alberta Views magazine. It's an excellent article, and it's actually very well researched. It's called, will the carbon tax, will it reduce pollution? And this is what Assistant Professor Trevor Tombay, a professor of economics at the University of Calgary, said in this article. For many economists, the price increase is enough. I don't think we should actually care too much about what the specific effect on emissions will be. What?
Whole point.
I thought the whole point was to reduce greenhouse gas emissions. Right. But that's what these, do you notice the shift in dogmatic language? It went from, we're going to reduce greenhouse gas emissions to, oh no, we have to somehow cover up and change the language because we're stealing from people and it's not going to reduce greenhouse gas emissions. So now the high priestess of the climate change cocktail circuit, when she gets up in here in the House, it's like price on pollution, price on pollution. Except it's not a price on pollution. It's not. If the carbon tax was supposed to reduce greenhouse gas emissions, then why are major emitters exempt from it? You know what? When she stood up in the House of Commons, Mr. Speaker, and said, oh, all of these major oil and gas companies are standing behind fortunately, former Premier Rachel Notley, and championing the carbon tax, $40 a ton. It's great. It's wonderful. Of course those companies were standing there. And why? Because they had already priced that into their production models. They didn't have to do anything to reduce their greenhouse gas emission profile. All that did was the junior oil and gas companies that had a profit margin where they could not operate with that priced them out of competitiveness on top of the C69, C42 bills that had punitive detrimental impacts on investment in those companies. All it did was price them out of the market. Bigger companies could come in and consolidate the assets, and that's the only way there's been any profit growth in the energy sector. And then, fast forward to today, where are all those big companies? Bye! See you later! Why would we possibly invest in a country where we have a government who fails day after day to have any sort of political stability in the regulatory sector? Bill C-69 doesn't have any better impacts for the environment, except for far-left activists who don't think that we should have an energy sector. And why? Because the only environmental outcome that they want is no development in the energy sector. So Bill C-69 and C-42 make the regulatory process so uncertain that we cannot attract investment in Canada. And worse off, let's look at this problem from a climate change perspective. Let's say we lose that investment to other countries. What happens? Does global demand for carbon decrease? No, we've seen global demand for carbon increase. So somebody is going to be supplying that demand. So when the Minister of the Environment and the Prime Minister prices Canadian energy out of competitiveness and those contracts go to the United States that has no carbon tax and less regulations, or to Saudi Arabia, the bastion of environmental standards and women's equality, when those jobs and those products and that demand is met by those countries, we are actually perpetuating the problem of climate change because that energy product is not happening in a country where we already have some of the strictest environmental standards in the world. And that is why there is no plan in this. If this government was serious about addressing the plan of climate change, they could have read through every single one of the questions that I outlined in 2006, because we do care about climate change. But if we're going to be serious about it, we can't put forward policy where there's no measurable outcome outside of loss of jobs. Let's talk about displacing the climate change burden. This is such a bourgeois, champagne, liberal philosophy. Oh, well, I can afford a carbon tax because I have my Bentley and my Grey Poupon and my trips to the Aga Khan Island. It's great for me. I'll just charge my grocery bill to Whole Foods Market, to the taxpayer here. That's great for that person, the Prime Minister of Canada, but it's not great for somebody who is being punished. Let's say a steel worker in Canada who actually cares about climate change and cares about having their job, but this government allows the Chinese to come in and dump steel while our manufacturers are subject to a carbon tax that the Chinese aren't subject to. So our steel isn't competitive. We lose jobs in that sector while we're benefiting an economy that has no rules on carbon emissions, right?
Yeah.
That is really where the rub of the climate change issue is. And you know what? I have been to some of these meetings around the world, And nobody there actually cares about having the tough conversation of saying, you know what, if you reach into your purse and you pull out a phone and it was tariff-free from a country that is coal-fired electricity and has very bad labor laws and is able to produce it cheaply because of a lack of a carbon tax, that is where we're contributing to greenhouse gas emissions. Nobody wants to have that conversation because it's the tough conversation to have. This is why the Kyoto Protocol didn't work, because there was no binding emissions on that. So for this government to go on the climate change cocktail circuit day after day and take pictures and sit around tables covered in grass that cost, $50,000 and say, I'm contributing to the environment with my paper straw. That is not changing outcomes. This government's had 3.5 years to do the same hard work we started. Say, you know what, Kyoto didn't work. And you know what, United States, China, you guys have got to step up to the table, right? Those conversations don't happen under these guys. We know that. We know that because we see it with the rest of their trade policies. Come on. That is the type of process. Now, of course, we have to take action here at home. Of course we do. But we can't look at Canada as a place where it's cold 8 months out of the year. You know what? A lot of our country doesn't have the luxury of being able to access public transit, and even those that do have trouble accessing it, you got to drive to work in a lot of places. Anybody who's watching from the Greater Toronto area and is looking at gas prices in Vancouver and thinking, what am I going to do at $1.80 a litre when I'm sitting in traffic for an hour and a half because this government hasn't been able to even get the money out that our Conservative government committed years ago because of their ineptitude? What is that going to do for me? The only thing, $1.80 a litre gas price, the only behavior it will change, and we've seen this in province after province after province, is voting intention. Because nobody is going to support a carbon tax because the emperor has no clothes. It doesn't reduce greenhouse gas emissions, it kills jobs, and it is bad public policy. It's bourgeois public policy, it's elitist public policy. It says that if you're a low-income mom, doesn't matter that you need to fill up your car. If you work in the energy sector, doesn't matter that you're going to lose your job to Oklahoma or Texas or anywhere in the US that has a more competitive regime. This government is out to lunch, and this motion, for anybody in Canada who cares about climate change, I do. And that is why I'm presenting a viewpoint that is opposite to the virtue signaling nonsense that this government has putting forward. Pictures in a climate change crusader costume does not reduce greenhouse gas emissions. $12 million to a privately funded rich corporation like Loblaws does not reduce greenhouse gas emissions. Hundreds of millions of dollars of corporate welfare that is handed out to lobbyists that can buy the environment minister the best steak dinner does not reduce greenhouse gas emissions. It's going to take tough policy like we put in place with the coal-fired electricity sector, passenger vehicles, and reduce that curve over time. Now, with regard to the oil and gas sector, you can't put in place policy that reduces greenhouse gas emissions in the oil and gas sector by killing the oil and gas sector. And I wish that there would be people that would have political courage just to stand up and say, that's the policy objective. Let's have that debate. I'll win that debate. They won't. There's a reason why we didn't put regulations with regard to greenhouse gas emissions on the oil and gas sector. And why? It's because the Americans, these guys stood up, and I was in here. Barack Obama was the climate change champion. Do you really think Barack Obama was going to put in place a carbon tax when he knew that their major industry in the US was just coming on stream with supply that was going to change them from a net energy importer to an energy independent nation? Of course not. So why would we regulate our industry out of competitiveness when we know that we can produce it cleaner with our own clean technology than those guys could, right? It's about setting that smart public policy that sets the sweet spot so that industry is incentive to adopt clean technology. Carbon tax is not going to do that, while ensuring that people in my community don't lose their job and that we continue to attract foreign direct investment and capital so that there's actually adoption incentives for that clean technology. That is the type of public policy discussion that we need on climate change. everything that is happening in the House of Commons this week, the Liberals and the NDP out liberaling and NDPing themselves on virtue signaling do-nothing motions in Captain Planet costumes. Anybody who cares about climate change in this country should vote against that and reject that. And anybody in this country that cares about jobs and the economy should ensure that the leader of the opposition becomes Prime Minister.
Wow. Questions and comments? Questions et commentaires. The honourable member for Guelph.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and thank you for the entertainment from across the way. There were 3 amendments that were proposed during the Conservatives' presentation. One of them related to climate change not being related to human activity. Could the honourable member maybe clarify the amendments that they've put on the floor rather than the rhetoric, in particular whether climate change is related to human activity? Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Member for Calgary Nose Hill.
Can you imagine if one of us had stood up and said that their speeches was, in a sarcastic tone, entertainment? You know what? Look, they might not agree with my public policy concerns. They might not agree with the fact that I actually have a background in energy economics and commercialized clean technology at the University of Canada, helped put together the business model for Carbon Management Canada, that I did that stuff and I actually know what I'm talking about because my community is dependent on getting this policy right. If I had done something like that to them, it would have been like, climate change denier, everything is terrible. So I reject that premise first and foremost. And second of all, I reject the virtue signaling. Read the amendment through you, Mr. Speaker. It says right in there, human activity has an impact on climate change. What I'm saying is this government's done nothing to mitigate the human impact of climate change in Canada or abroad. The only thing that it has done is used its platform on the international stage. Canada is back to take pictures and have cocktails and eat canapes. They haven't had the hard conversations with China. They blew it with the Americans. And they're penalizing our industries through reverse tariffs, through policies like this. If, you know, if the environment minister wants to stand up and quote Bill Nye, the science guy, and quote his passion, then she better look in the mirror, because she's done nothing to reduce greenhouse gas emissions in this country.
Questions and comments? Questions et commentaires. The honourable member for Cowichan Malahat Langford.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and thank you to the member for Calgary Nose Hill for her speech. You know, I was just reading an article in iPolitics from a couple of years ago where it talked about when Preston Manning was distributing a Fraser Institute report amongst the Conservative colleagues, urging them to adopt a carbon tax because it was a market-based mechanism. And I'm just trying to wonder how the Conservative opinion has shifted from Mr. Manning's. But that aside, I agree with the member for Calgary Nose Hill that a carbon tax is going to be ineffective if it's only selectively applied. If we were going to put a price on pollution, it has to apply to everyone equally. I'm worried that this debate is concentrating too much on the here and now, the costs of this and that and so on and so forth. I want to look 20, 30, 40 years into the future and look at what the costs of climate change are actually going to put on our economy. For example, in my province of British Columbia, the forest fire budget is putting a big dent in our coffers. We know what the costs will be for mitigating floods and so on. So with that in mind, the economic costs of climate change, I'm just wondering, you know, if we can find some common ground, and if the member for Calgary Nose Hill can maybe give her opinion and her thoughts on some of the opportunities that exist in the renewable energy economy of the future, how organizations like Iron and Earth, which are oil sands workers, want to take their skill set and transition to the renewable energy economy of the future, so that we are actually providing that just transition. Because, Mr. Speaker, this change is going to be forced upon us one way or the other. We're either going to react to it or we're going to be proactive towards it. Thank you.
Member for Calgary Nose Hill.
I want to put on the record that I vehemently and strongly disagree with Preston Manning's take on the carbon tax. He's wrong. It's not a policy instrument that works. I don't care if he's Conservative or not. There is no data to show that carbon is price elastic in Canada to the point where a $40 ton is going to change behavior and allow the economy to grow. The reality is for that price has probably got to be at least
150 to 300.
At least 300.
Yeah.
And at that price, the only gains that you're going to get are sharp economic shocks, and I don't want the single mom in my riding to not be able to drive to work. I don't want our country to go into the toilet economically. It's a false economy, and Preston's wrong. He's wrong. So number one. Number two, my colleague talked about the here and now versus the future. Well, the future is determined by the here and now, and if we're talking about policies, we're not measuring it based on greenhouse gas emissions reduction, then the future is we're never going to see that reduction. That's just the reality. So you can't support a policy instrument that is bunk in the Canadian context. Maybe it works in Monaco when you have a small little principality that has public transit everywhere and it's loaded with billionaires. It's not going to work in the Canadian context. It just doesn't. Like, anybody that has any background in economics knows that a carbon tax functions like a consumption tax. It does not change behavior. Outside of probably political behavior and behavior of things like going to work or creating jobs, right? It's a problem. There is no substitute good for carbon in Canada. But if we wanted to get to that point where we were, to my colleagues opposite, talking about adoption of clean technologies and stuff, you need to have an industry and capital to receive that technology and adopt it. So while we've been so busy chasing capital out of the country in the energy sector, we've been doing that at the detriment of our clean tech sector and all the workers that he just talked about, because those jobs aren't going to happen here. They're going to happen in the U.S. Come on. This is basic economics. These motions that are before us today are embarrassing. They don't talk about, I'm good to go on any one of these topics. I will debate price elasticity of carbon price. I will debate the best way to incent clean technology. We're not having that conversation. We're having a bunk out left versus left, virtue signaling conversation for votes, and that's the real problem with the climate change debate in Canada right now.
Questions and comments? Questions et commentaires. The honourable member for Winnipeg South.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I want to thank the honourable member for her speech, and I hope everyone excuses my voice today. Mr. Speaker, I know the honourable member has proud Manitoba roots and is now a proud Albertan. She will know that Manitoba experienced two 1 in 300-year floods, costing our economy $1 billion each. This, of course, is in addition to the $6 billion Calgary flood. So it is very good to hear her acknowledge the reality of climate change and that we do indeed have to act. Mr. Speaker, I wanted to pick up on something that the honourable member from the NDP just picked up on, and that is just about every conservative economist that I have ever read of on this topic, Mr. Speaker, supports a price on pollution. People who advised Prime Minister Harper, people who advised Preston Manning, of course, and of course our own Brian Pallister, the Premier of Manitoba, was about to put a price of $25 per ton above our level, Mr. Speaker, and he seemed quite satisfied with that. Of course, he had a disagreement with the federal government on increasing that, but he did, Mr. Speaker, indicate to those far and wide that a price on pollution was one of a range of measures which would be effective in reducing greenhouse gases in Manitoba and contributing to our national reduction. Mr. Speaker, I wonder if the honourable member would just comment, by the calculations that I've seen by economists, by 2022, a price on pollution across Canada will cut emissions by $50 to $60 million, or 50 to 60 million tons, Mr. Speaker, and we've seen the evidence from British Columbia, where there was a 7% reduction through their price on pollution. Mr. Speaker.
Calgary Nose Hill.
Well, first of all, I don't care what political stripe the economist is. A carbon tax doesn't work in Canada, and the member from my home riding of Winnipeg South should understand that Winnipeg is not Vancouver. It's not Vancouver. It's really cold in Winnipeg. I would love for him to walk down my mom's street and tell her in the middle of January, and you can imagine my mom, she birthed me. I would love for her to go to her door and say, guess what, Kim? We're going to make you pay another $100 so that and then my mom would ask him this, how much do I got to pay? so that Winnipeg doesn't flood next year? And I don't think he'd have an answer. And that's the reality. There's no price elasticity data that shows that $40 a ton is going to reduce greenhouse gas emissions. All it does is make me get angry phone calls from my constituents and his constituents saying, why are they doing this? And of course the Premier of Manitoba looked at that data and said, nope, this is a bad piece of public policy, which is exactly what this Liberal government should be doing. You know, and the other thing is, let's talk about floods in Manitoba as well, too. You know, I sandbagged along the Red River in 1997. I care about ensuring that doesn't happen. But where has the member been on the fact that Manitoba has drained 60% of its wetlands over the last 60 years? Where's their policy on that? Where is their support for the Nature Conservancy? I'm not saying we have to have a holistic approach to environmental management in Canada. Yes, flood mitigation infrastructure. Yes, looking at all these projects. But that's the problem with this government, is that they have hung their hat on a consumption tax that is solely designed to offset the fact that they've spent billions of dollars into oblivion on nothing. And
Order. À l'ordre, conformément à l'article 38 du règlement, je dois faire connaître à la Chambre les questions qu'elle abordera à l'heure de l'ajournement ce soir. The honourable member for Regina Louvain, oral questions.